Thank you for joining tonight's Alison R. Bernstein Media Mentoring Program event, Photos and Stories, Who Gets to Decide? Tonight's conversation will focus on the role that different forms of media play in the conversation about international human rights. We will hear from experts in the field, Cathy Otten, Daniella Zalcman, and Ardra Manasi. I sent out their full bios earlier, along with a short fact sheet on human rights, so I'll just briefly introduce them all now. So first, we're going to hear an introduction on the topic from Cathy Otten. Cathy is a journalist and reporter who has spent time covering the stories of Yazidi women who survived the 2014 ISIS attacks in Iraq. She has written extensively about this in her book, With Ash on Their Faces. And she also runs the Journalism Initiative on Gender-Based Violence at Rutgers University, through which she has published a book called Silence and Omissions, a media guide for covering gender-based violence. And then we'll have a conversation between Daniella and Ardra. So Daniella Zalcman is a documentary photographer whose work focuses on the legacies of Western colonization, such as the rise of homophobia in East Africa and the forced assimilation of education for Indigenous children in North America. She's also the founder of Women Photograph, which is a nonprofit that elevates the voices of women and non-binary visual journalists. And then joining her will be Ardra Manasi, who is the Global Program Manager at the Center for Innovation in Worker Organization at Rutgers. She has a background and expertise in labor rights, gender, migration, and development technology, and has conducted advocacy around the world for women workers in both the formal and informal sectors, and about their rights under the International Labor Organization Convention 190, which was the first international treaty to address violence and harassment in the world of work. So I'm going to start with Cathy's introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Daniella and Ardra.
Hello and welcome. My name is Cathy and I run the Journalism Initiative on Gender-Based Violence here at the Institute for Women's Leadership. The initiative runs workshops and programs with journalists all over the world, promoting ethical and trauma-informed reporting on gender-based violence. But, telling stories ethically and reporting on human rights is not just a job for journalists. I know that some of you are already established or aspiring professionals in PR, marketing, advertising, communications, design, TV, film, politics, or social media. And whatever path your career continues on, telling stories with an ethical and a humane eye will increase the quality of the public debate for everyone, especially if you move into jobs like teaching or law, human rights, or politics. Because how we tell stories shapes the world. And when journalists misreport or fail to cover the real problems of society, we as the voting public, we lack the information that we need to then make informed choices at the ballot box. And the same is especially true when it comes to bad reporting on women, gender, and violence. Shallow or contextless reporting means that we don't have the information to put the pressure on our elected officials and force through more humane policies on gender, on women's rights, on reproductive and sexual rights. And you may think this stuff doesn't matter, but I can give a few examples of reporting that did shift the dial and did have a real world impact. For instance, reporting on the Me Too movement in the US. Key stories on the murder of Dalit H&M factory worker Jayasara Kathy Raval in India, and a groundbreaking investigation into abductions and rapes in the Democratic Republic of Congo. All of these stories led to convictions and/or key policy changes. Jayasara in India, in southern India, was murdered on New Year's Day in 2021 by her male supervisor. and this was after months of sexual harassment. And in the aftermath of the murder, her colleagues reported the endemic sexual harassment to the Guardian newspaper in the UK, where the story was first published in February, a month later. Labour unions were also involved in applying pressure, and a global campaign began called the Justice for Jayasara movement. And that movement forced H&M to agree to new protections against gender-based violence and harassment, and worker-led monitoring of GBV and caste-based discrimination on the shop floor. And these are the places, these are the factories that make the clothes that you or I might wear. So this is real world stuff, and it matters. In 2016, American journalist Lauren Wolfe published a story in The Guardian about a series of rapes in a town in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Her story was based on extensive on-the-ground investigations. Hours after the story was published, arrest warrants were issued for a local MP and 67 of his associates. Later that day, they were in custody. In the months that followed, Lauren published another story about the investigation, where she said she protected the identity of her local sources and allowed the voices of survivors to be heard around the world. And since then, not a single girl in Kavumu has been abducted or raped. And so telling stories humanely means centering survivors, not the perpetrators, and using a trauma-informed approach when interviewing. When telling the stories of survivors ethically, we focus on uplifting ongoing efforts towards justice and redress. And if there are none, then we ask those in power why not. It also means adding the correct context. Sometimes human stories are told in the media for shock value or because they're entertaining or gruesome. This is often true of stories about femicide, trans issues, missing women, and trafficking. When this happens, it encourages the audience to view women and women's issues as fodder for entertainment and spectacle only, instead of sites of potentially transformative social change. And it's not all about trauma-informed interviewing and the survivor-centered approach. It's also about the words you choose when you create your social media posts or company blogs. It's about whose voice you use to tell the stories and whether you choose images that dignify people or humiliate them. So it doesn't just apply to journalists. Creative communication on human rights is also about refusing to use cliches and boring language. We want to surprise our audience and shock them into taking action. Perhaps we can use data and statistics alongside illustration in fresh and informative ways. For an example of this, look to the work of the New York Times contributor Mona Chalabi. She won the Pulitzer Prize last year for her explanatory illustration on women's issues. And she's now busy creating illustrated infographics on media bias in the coverage of Israel's war on Gaza. I recently read an excellent article on Vox.com about sexual violence and the terror group Hamas's use of rape as a weapon of war against Israelis. The article contextualized what happened on October the 7th and gave background details about the use of sexual violence in conflict, its prevalence, how it's underreported and often goes unreported, and then grounded the events in the historical perspective of the ongoing apartheid in Palestine and sexual violence used against Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. I haven't seen anything since or before that was so informative, mature, and unsensational in its handling of a difficult topic. And that's what good journalism does. It informs. It doesn't seek just to entertain. And this story stands in stark contrast to some reporting by the Washington Post and the New York Times. Both newspapers recently published stories on the same issue, full of poorly sourced, graphic, sensationalized details and descriptions. In the case of the New York Times story, the Israeli family of one of the victims who was killed by Hamas later said they felt used and lied to by the reporters. This is what we want to avoid when reporting and writing about sexual violence and gender-based violence. If we don't treat survivors with dignity and write about them with respect, then we have failed. In the case of my book about the crimes committed by ISIS against the Yazidi people in Iraq, called With Ash on Their Faces, I wrote about the way Yazidi women passed down stories of resistance to enslavement during the Armenian genocide 100 years ago, and how their granddaughters used similar strategies of resistance when they were enslaved in ISIS prisons, such as tattooing their forearms with the number of loved ones or sewing messages inside their undergarment. These methods built up a kind of oral feminist refrain of disobedience to violent, misogynistic genocidal attacks that had gone on for hundreds of years by different belligerents. These stories were described by Yazidi women who escaped ISIS, and they had heard the same stories of resistance from their grandmothers when they were children sitting by the fire, and recounted them to me during the 5 years I spent living and working in Iraq. And one of the factors that motivated me to write the book was witnessing how journalists were queuing up to interview Yazidi survivors of ISIS sexual violence. But in their reports, the women were presented only as victims without wishes, desires, thoughts, political visions, or backstories. And I wanted to do something different. I don't know if I was successful, but at least we are here together today to think about how we can try and tell stories differently. So with my initiative, the Journalism Initiative on Gender-Based Violence, I'll be training journalists this year in Nepal and Iraqi Kurdistan. In Iraq, I've co-written a media ethics pact with a Kurdish women's rights organization. The pact is for media organizations covering gender-based violence and lays out basic ethical principles for journalists, as well as enshrining rules and best practices around keeping women journalists safe. Women journalists and media workers globally receive far more harassment for reporting on gender-based violence, both in person and online. Far more harassment than men. But both men and women journalists are not safe in many parts of the world. They can be killed, assassinated, attacked for their reporting on political issues, on corruption, on violence, and particularly on violence against women. And sometimes trying to report on these issues, you're just met with a wall of silence from media organizations. So there are many barriers when it comes to reporting on gender-based violence and doing so safely. But this is not a reason to stay away from difficult topics. It's important to think about how we can keep each other safe and work together to ensure equal rights and equal participation for women in the workplace without fear of harassment. And promoting these standards is a main part of my job with the Institute for Women's Leadership. And my initiative is also working on an academic book with 2 other Rutgers colleagues and a legal scholar about how common cases of gender-based violence actually do amount to crimes against humanity under international law. Now, this may sound obscure, but if we treat gender-based violence as the emergency it is, rather than as a natural fact of life for women and gender non-conforming people, then we can perhaps change the way people think about gender-based violence and work towards ending it for good. Thank you very much for having me.
So Now that we have heard a short introduction from Cathy, I'd like to hand it over to Ardra and Daniella for tonight's conversation. So Ardra.
Thank you, Nishi. And thank you, IWL, for having me here. It's really exciting to be in this space and to be learning from two amazing and inspiring women, both Daniela and Cathy. So it's great to be here. And on this occasion, I also want to remember and honor the legacy of Alison Bernstein, under whose name this program has been named. She was an educator and she was a strong champion of women's rights. So her legacy continues to live on. So just wanted to remember her. And Nishi was sharing your profiles with me, and it was really interesting to learn the kind of work that you all are doing. And it's a diverse group here, a diverse group of women in media here. And it was really interesting to learn more about your work. So to contextualize our conversation today a bit, we live in this world marred by different conflicts, a great extent of human rights violations. And also we see a backlash against women's rights and a regression in women's rights, if I may. So in this kind of a complex, chaotic world, what role does media play in protecting human rights? And I think that's a question that I'm really interested to hear from Daniela. And we've heard some of this from Cathy today about the role of media, for instance, for empowering or giving voice to the most vulnerable of groups, or for changing the perception about how we look at the world, or even holding different actors accountable, be it, state, government, or non-state actors. So we've also seen that for just doing their work, journalists and media professionals at large can be killed, can be targeted, can be murdered, can be abducted, can be raped. And we see this on a day-to-day basis. If you look at the conflicts in the Middle East or Ukraine, and you just name it. And this doesn't just happen in the conflict setting, it also happens in the non-conflict settings. And I think we also need to acknowledge the fact that women and non-binary groups are at an increased risk when it comes to this different forms of harassment and violence. And it can be because of their gender, race, ethnicity, and all other factors. And I was just looking at some of the numbers, and it was really shocking to learn that this data is from the UN from 2021. And it said that the killing of women journalists as a percentage to the whole nearly doubled in 2021. So this kind of talks about some of the unsafe conditions. And I'm just giving journalists as an example here, but we can talk about women in media at large. But some of the unsafe conditions in which, media practitioners are operating. And lastly, I think we also need to briefly talk about the changing nature of media itself, because we see a shift from the traditional or legacy media, as we call it, the print, television, radio, to newer forms, new media, which is like social media, blogs and so on. And they are also transforming the society, and they're also posing new forms of challenges. So I hope we can get into some of these today. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Daniela to learn more about, women's representation, women's participation, as well as, I hope we'll get to talk about women in media as women workers as well. So Daniela, as we were listening to Cathy, I think she was really talking about how journalists can sometimes play the role of human rights defenders. And she gave us some great examples, including her work in Iraq. So you are a visual journalist and you mainly work in the domain of documentary photography. So in a world where there is so much tokenism, or again, we are talking about social media, there is clickbaits and likes and sensationalizing stories. how do we actually spur action and social change? And what have you seen based on your work?
You know, it's such a hard question because the ways in which we all consume and engage with photography has changed so dramatically just in the past 10 years. You know, I think the introduction of a lot of mainstream social media sites has completely shifted our consumption of images, and just the evolution of those platforms in recent years has also sort of created, additional types of barriers to our ability to fully and deeply consume and consider images. You know, I'm currently teaching a class at Tulane called The Ethics of Visual Journalism, and something I talk to my students about a lot that I know they experience is we just experience this type of whiplash constantly of, here's a photo of your friends out at brunch, and here's a photo from a war zone, and here's a photo from, you know, your friend of their dog's Instagram account, and now here's another image of a deeply traumatic breaking news story. And to some extent, even, you know, as a visual journalist who deeply believes in the power and the necessity of visual journalism, I also increasingly am feeling like we need to be much more guarded and much more thoughtful about how and where and why we release hard news images, because they are hard to consume and they should be hard to consume. And I think, unfortunately, many of us, particularly, you know, students in that generation, we have become so numb to violent imagery because it is all around us on a regular basis, both fictional and non-fictional. And so those images lose their weight and lose their significance to spur us to actually do something to create the change that many journalists hope for will come as the aftermath of their photography. So, you know, something that I use regularly to talk about in classes is Nick Ut's photo called Napalm Girl that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That I'm sure there have been multiple dissertations written on this, but I think that photo was hugely responsible for turning the tide of American public opinion against the Vietnam War, because A, people did not have great visual access to what was happening on the ground in Vietnam, and B, it was a shocking, violent, terrible photograph to witness. And, you know, I like to talk about it because there are all these extenuating circumstances of the photographer. Actually, he made the photo, but then he put down his cameras and he wrapped the girl up in a blanket and took her to seek medical care and saved her life. And at the time, as an AP photographer, violated any number of ethical rules that would have been in place for him as an Associated Press photographer, but was a person first and a journalist second. And, you know, I always think it's important to nod to that. But we don't have the same relationship to images of conflict and trauma these days. And it's not that they shouldn't be made. We need them for the historical record. We need them for accountability. We need them to shine a light on terrible things that are happening all over the world. But I think we certainly, all of us, both individuals, because all of us now are essentially small-scale publishers using our own social media platforms, and certainly media organizations using their own platforms on various third-party websites and their own websites, we need to be much more cautious and thoughtful and methodical about how and where we're trying to reach our audiences, because there's such an inundation of particularly violent graphic imagery. And if we want the stories that matter most to us to have the impact we hope it will, I think we need to create better guardrails and better ethical guidelines and better ways of getting these images out into the world.
Thanks, Daniella. I think what I'm hearing is the need for like responsible and ethical use of, you know, images, even at an individual level, to be conscious at least. I think that's the first step.
And I think, sorry,
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
I sidetracked a little bit from your original question, which was, you know, how can images still have the power to help? And I do deeply believe that they can, and that in the right hands, we absolutely can weaponize images to speak truth to power, to hold people doing violent, terrible things accountable. So I do believe in that, but I wanted to couch it in the concern that I have that if we are continuing to generate, publish, consume such a high level of these images constantly, they will lose, and I think in many ways they have lost a lot of their significance and their power.
And I think it's also about how the stories are being told, and as a visual journalist, I also want to, like, again, I know you presented a nuanced picture about the downside of using social media, maybe. But at the same time, do you think social media can also positively kind of impact it? Have you seen examples based on your work where maybe a hashtag activism, though I was talking about the kind of performativity or tokenism which goes along with it? Have you seen positive examples as well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the most important thing, and of course, there's always negatives to this as well, but if we think back to the platforms that major media outlets had in the 1970s, for instance, if you wanted to reach an audience of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, you only really could do that through something like a newspaper, a magazine, a TV network, a radio station. Now we all have the potential to have our own platforms where we can directly reach millions of people, whether or not we're journalists, whether if we have something powerful and interesting and compelling to say, or, in some cases, maybe even if we don't, we have the ability to directly create and reach an audience. And there is such a democratic power in that. And it's unfortunately partially why journalism is struggling so much right now, is that we have not figured that out, that people don't need us as much anymore. And so if we are going to continue to work in communities, we need to very rapidly evolve the way in which we engage with those communities. We need to center community needs, information gaps, and think about how we can actually work alongside particularly marginalized and underserved and disenfranchised communities we've historically covered, because they don't need us anymore, and they have the capacity to bring their own stories to the general public. And so if we continue in the unfortunately vaguely colonial, patriarchal, racist framework that unfortunately journalism operated under for a very long time, we aren't going to have that many communities left who actually are going to want to participate in our journalism. So I think there is vast power in social media. It also, is rotting our brains from the inside and doing all these other terrible things. But I think there is so much potential and possibility there as well.
That's great. And it struck me that, even it made me think, even the traditional kind of, print media, even they're trying to be on social media these days, right? They're also like kind of changing the way they operate. So that's also interesting. So thanks for pointing us to that. And Daniela, I really want to talk more about your work now. So Women Photograph is a platform that you founded in 2017. And currently it's a hiring database with more than 1,600 plus women, and that too from more than 100 plus countries. So tell us a bit more about this initiative, and what led you to launch this platform? And was there like an aha moment when you realized this is what I want to do?
So around 2014, 2015, a large foundation and award organization in the visual media industry, World Press Photo, started publishing sort of a state of the industry survey that revealed that roughly 85% of working photojournalists identified as men. And that is a glaring problem, not just from a hiring equity standpoint, but it's also an ethical issue, because it means that we are potentially consuming 85% of the news images that we see through the lived experience of and perspective of male journalists. And while there's nothing wrong inherently with that perspective, if we think about the spaces that men will not be allowed into, if we think about the stories that men cannot tell or maybe are not interested in telling, it is so profoundly going to shape the stories that we record for posterity, the stories that the general public is able to consume. And so we have to build a media industry, a visual media industry, any subset, any group of people responsible for telling stories to the general public. We have to make sure that that community of workers is as diverse as the communities they're covering, or we will not do a good, complete, nuanced job of telling stories. It's a very simple, fixable problem. And unfortunately, many media industries remain overwhelmingly white, Western, cisgender, and in this case, male. So in response to that, and in response to, just feeling a lot of specific frustration with my industry and a lot of the publications that I worked for, I launched Women Photograph in almost a week exactly, 1 week and 7 years ago today.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so we have a community of, I believe it's between 15 and 1,600 independent women and non-binary visual journalists based in about 125 countries. And that hiring database is sort of our most important public-facing program. So it's, anyone can go on womenphotograph.com. I would encourage all of you to go and just browse because there's some incredible photographers there. We also have a number of programs that are meant to support our members. So we are a grant-making organization. We've given out about $275,000 in project grants. We have an annual mentorship program for early career photographers looking for support from really incredible photo editors and photographers and curators in the industry. We have an annual skills building workshop. We collect a lot of data on hiring and publishing statistics in the industry. So everything is either in service of trying to push the industry in the direction of parity, which is where we know we should be, even though we are very far from that, and also trying to provide structural support for our members and at large for all women and non-binary photographers.
Wow, that's incredible. And I just dropped the link in the chat box, and I hope all of you here, you might want to check out the links and even be part of this platform. And I also read that last year, based on this work, Women Photograph, you also worked on a book, which is What We See.
Yes. And I actually got it right here.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I'm a terrible visual person. I just realized I completely backlit myself for this video. I'm so sorry, everyone. But yes, we published this book last year on International Women's Day. And it features the work of 100 of our members. It spans about 50 years of visual history. I mean, I'm completely biased because I curated it, but I think it's incredible and beautiful and is a lovely coffee table book or gift. We get contributors from all over the world, from sort of all sub-genres of documentary photography. And I think it's a very powerful series of perspectives. And in a lot of ways, I think highlights what we miss when, again, we're consuming an overwhelming number of news images that were made by men.
Wow, and the statistics was shocking, like 85% of photojournalists. And yeah, that I think speaks for itself. And I think you call the book a revisionist history. That's what I read. So it's about I don't know, it's not retelling, but telling the stories differently, as Cathy was putting it, maybe.
Yeah, and I think, even if I would argue that there are a constellation of different variables for each individual that define how we move through the world and who is going to look at us and decide arbitrarily to let us into their homes and lives and stories or not. And some of those are identity-based, some of those are personality-based, some of those are because of the experiences you had as you grew up. But there are an undeniable number of circumstances that men are just not allowed access to. And so if we think to documentation of, for instance, the US invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, in conservative Muslim society, we missed out on a huge number of women's stories because those majority male photographers and writers would not have been allowed access. And that's a real problem. That means that we are missing out on half of society, on the impact of conflict, on the aftermath of conflict that we just didn't get to see many of those stories. And that's not just for Muslim societies, that's true for Jewish societies and many conservative Christian societies. So we think it's important, I think, as much as we consume and as much as we see, it's also important to remember the stories that we don't see, and what's missing. And I hope this book in a lot of ways remedies that. So
Wonderful. I look forward to grabbing a copy soon, but yeah. I'm circling back to the social media bit because I'm still thinking about traditional versus new media. So based on, you worked on this book and you have this platform, Women Photograph. Do you feel that social media has actually led to more inclusive ways of storytelling, especially for women and also non-binary groups?
I think overall, yes. And again, I think it is down to that notion that anyone can develop their own audience. If they have something to say, if they have stories to tell, you will find your niche and you will find your audience. And I have a complicated relationship with all of these platforms and the ethics behind many of them. But they did, particularly in the early days before they became a little more ethically fraught, they did allow us to just connect with ordinary people in a really lovely and kind of magical way. And that leveled the playing field, created this layer of democracy that never really was part of the relationship between journalist and documented community. That, there has always been such a divide in power and hierarchy between most of the journalism community and most of the communities that they are responsible for covering. And I think social media has helped level that in a lot of ways, even outside the context of people taking control of their own narratives and deciding to tell their own stories. It's given individuals more accountability. It's given them the ability to chase down journalists who've done harm and say, hey, what was that? Why did you think that was an acceptable way to tell this story? And, like just thinking about the models that were, or the only model that existed, again, sort of mid-late 20th century, was a journalist would probably parachute into a community they didn't belong to, talk to some people, write a story, publish some photographs, and very likely never speak to those individuals ever again. There would never be any post-publication follow-up. There would never be any accountability if they had got something wrong or done harm to someone. I'm thinking of specific examples, and I won't call anyone out, but it was almost endemic in journalism. And all of a sudden, we're all very easy to find, and you cannot escape. And, to some extent, we've also created this culture of attacking people and being overly nasty on the internet. That's also not great. But the level of accountability, I think, is very important and very healthy for journalists.
Very interesting, because we were always talking about media holding others accountable, but I think you brought in the other side of things, social media, to hold journalists accountable, and that's interesting.
At its best, that is absolutely what journalism can and should do. And there are so many, we know so many incredible examples of wonderful, brilliant journalists who've done that. But also, there are many journalists, past and present, who have done a lot of harm in community and have not figured out how to adapt the principles and the ethics that govern the work that they do quickly enough. And for better or for worse, I think modern technology has actually forced them to push a little bit further in that direction.
You talking about like ethics and around the whole issue made me think of this, because we are living in this age of AI, deep fakes, disinformation is on the rise. And recently, I think Nishi also like pointed that piece to me where there was an article when Taylor Swift, an AI generated sexually explicit image of Taylor Swift went viral. And I think it was almost after 45 million searches that X, formerly Twitter, put a ban on that. And on the other end, there were, her fans were trying to like post positive pictures to kind of replace the harm which was done. She has that kind of clout and fan base to do this, but many of us here don't, and we suffer the consequences. So, talking about, so we live in this whole, in such scenarios, what are some of the ethical measures that we can take to make sure that the representation, we represent the subject in the best way possible without causing harm to the subject? And I'm generally talking about the risk posed by AI and yeah.
Well, when it comes to AI generated imagery, I think the most important thing that we can do, that technology and the harmful weaponization of technology is always a few steps ahead of people trying to come up with solutions. And to me, one of the most troubling parts of the fact that imagery, we consume hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs a day. Our eyeballs scan, see, consume, glaze over from just an unbelievable number of images on a daily basis now, depending on the social media platforms we frequent, depending on what cities we live in and how much advertising there is. But we have not fully incorporated into mainstream education in the United States visual literacy. We spend a lot of time teaching young people here is how you read and understand and break down text and make sure that you can understand the nuance and you can think critically about it and how it was constructed and why. But we do not do that, to my knowledge, in a systematic way in American middle schools and high schools. And we desperately need to, because more and more of the information that we encounter and consume is visual. And there are so many things about that that I think are wonderful. There is again, I keep using the word democratic, but I think there is a particular democracy to visual media, because you don't necessarily, anyone can look at a photograph and grasp some level of knowledge, information from it. That has so much power, but also it's very easy to be misled by a photograph, by a manipulated photograph, by an AI generated photograph, by a photograph that's been miscontextualized with a willfully incorrect or accidentally incorrect caption. There are, and that is the flip side of social media, is that for all of the good that it has brought to, leveling the playing field in many ways, it's also exposed us to a lot of information that's just pure nonsense. And so we have to figure out how to educate ourselves, how to educate young people, so that we are less at risk of being taken in by things that are either meant to harm us and mislead us or are just accidentally incorrect. But they're both risks. And I don't think there is enough thought around that and around just general education. So, I think your question about ethics around protecting individual sources is very, very important. But to some extent, I almost think they're separate conversations. I think one thing that I do think is really important is if we are working with, again, particularly people on the lower end of the power spectrum, people who have historically been from, or have been from communities who historically have been misrepresented or underrepresented in media, that we have a very serious obligation to talk to people about what the worst case scenario is that can happen with their images. And it's not just, I'm a journalist with National Geographic. I'm making this photograph of you. I'm going to publish it in National Geographic Magazine. It will also go on their social media, on their Instagram account. Here's what could happen next if there are bad actors on the internet who are harmful, who are cruel, who are racist, who are misogynistic, because that happens all the time. And to some extent, I feel like many journalists believe, well, it's not, we don't have control over that. People on the internet are people on the internet. I kind of feel like, no, it is our responsibility. It is our problem. And if something that we created is doing harm to someone who's trusted us with their story, with their vulnerability, with their time, it's kind of on us to figure out how to fix the problem and go to bat with our editors and our newsrooms and say, like, hey, you need to take this down. You are putting someone's life in danger. You are exposing them to incredible vitriol that they are not prepared to face. We have to do something differently. And again, this is just one of those things that I don't think we've had enough or critical enough conversations about yet.
I'm glad you brought it up, and we have a comment in the chat which says, idea of instituting visual literacy courses. They really like the idea, so I think it's very important. And I really like how you brought in the responsibility on the side of the journalist as well, because I was always thinking about laws and policies and regulations to address it, but I think it boils down to, our personal responsibility as well at times.
But you're right. In some capacities, things will only change if there are actual regulatory shifts and policy shifts. And so we absolutely should be thinking about what those might be and advocating for them. But also at the end of the day, I believe that a journalist's responsibility is to the people who have trusted them with their story. And if we cannot do everything in our power to protect them and keep them safe, then I'm not sure we're doing our jobs in the best way possible.
Right. And it also made me think of Cathy's remarks about, survivor-centered approaches, especially when we are talking about reporting on gender-based violence survivors and making sure that they're not re-victimized when their stories are being retold. And we've seen that happen a lot. And coming back to looking at women in media as women workers, as I said, that was a dimension I was really interested in. And I think Cathy spoke about how women in media and women journalists, she spoke mainly about journalists, are at a higher risk when it comes to different forms of violence and harassment, and especially online harassment. There is data showing how women women journalists and, women in general are at more risk of online harassment compared to men. So you are someone who, tend to work with women and you tend to mentor women as well on a daily basis. So what have you seen based on, what are some of the unique challenges faced by women in media and how do we address them?
Well, whatever we're calling Twitter these days, a lot of these social media platforms have become truly cesspits of people with too much time and bad opinions. Um, and yeah, I mean, online harassment of particularly women and non-binary journalists is truly out of control and just a symptom of the deep misogyny that continues to pervade our society. I do want to say though that something that I think that's worth pointing out is, I very often hear the argument that women are more at risk in more of a physical context while doing their jobs while in the field. And I don't, are we more at risk of sexual violence? Absolutely. And that is horrific and should never have to happen to any woman, much less women journalists. But that being said, I think we all have, again, in thinking about the ways in which we move through the world and different ways we, encounter different situations, I think men are more at risk of physical violence. I think it's more likely that a male photojournalist is going to be physically beaten badly, roughed up while being detained than a woman. And, sometimes I don't know, we can call it the patriarchy working in our favor that, we're too delicate for that kind of treatment. But I think this notion, this rhetoric that women are more at risk when they go into the field sometimes is the thing that holds us back from getting the assignments and doing the work that we want to do, because there is this paternalism of, oh no, we can't send her to the front lines, she has kids, or we can't send her to the front lines, it's dangerous and she shouldn't do that. When, if we've gotten into this field, we know what we've signed up for. And so I just want to nod to that I think we all face different risks when we're working, and yes, there is definitely a higher risk of sexual violence for women, but there are just as many violent, horrible risks for male journalists working in complicated and hostile environments as well. And online harassment, unfortunately, I think is just down to the fact that people are really terrible to women online. And I think, I hope and I'm sorry, I should know more about the folks that we're speaking with. I imagine you're all potential future journalists. But I think unfortunately doing this job requires that you have a pretty thick skin and that you remember what is driving you and motivating you to do this work. And it's hard and it's demoralizing when you've got some troll in his mom's basement who is attacking you and calling you horrible names. It's very easy to let that get to you. But I think we have to remember the mission behind our work, the reasons why we do the work that we do, and hit that block button and try as best you can not to let it get to you.
That's great advice. And thank you for presenting that nuanced picture. And you're right, like violence, I mean, even the conversations around it may lead to more self-censoring or even people leaving the profession, and it shouldn't lead to that. But I also want to briefly acknowledge that because, this was some of the work that Nishi and I did work on in the past, which is around ILO Convention 190, which is the first international treaty to address violence and harassment in the world of work. And the convention really talks about world of work as opposed to, a workplace. And workplace can be like the physical setting. But world of work is much more, it can be public and private spaces. And I think I was just, when you were talking about it, I was really thinking about journalists. And, it can be sometimes some of them, some of the audience here are their social media strategists. So their workplace is the online space.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or a journalist might be out there in the street covering a protest. Her workplace is there. So I think we also need to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, and an unfortunate reality, I think for many people in my field, post the Me Too movement, I think from conversations with my colleagues, we are frequently more at risk and more threatened by people within our industry than the people we encounter out in the world. The former second most important photo editor at National Geographic was fired after decades of women complaining, and a number of people have lost high positions in the photo industry. But increasingly, particularly in an industry where most of us are now independent contractors and don't have the protections of corporate HR, and certainly don't have a corporate HR department that is looking out for our best interests because we're just freelancers. It means that we're even more at risk and we're even more unprotected. And so, I don't know what the answer is, whether it's unionizing or just building solidarity and community so we can all keep each other safe. But for me, the answer to many of these questions always comes back to community. We're safer and stronger and more protected when we're able to work together, build solidarity, build resources, and also speak openly with each other to make sure that we stay safe.
Thank you for that. I'm just looking at the chat box too. So just on the housekeeping note, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat box. We'll definitely, get back to it at the end of this discussion. And I see all the comments and high fives. This will be my last question before we move on to maybe more of an interactive session with our audience here. Again, we as I mentioned, it's a very diverse group of women in media here. Some of them are from PR, some of them are from advertising, filmmaking, television, social media, and different fields. So, and you are somebody with extensive experience in the field of documentary photography. Do you have any advice for them? And I'm really talking about some of the nitty-gritties of navigating this field. Like, how do you get your work commissioned? How do you edit a piece? Or, how do you file a grant application? Or even use social media to your advantage? Yeah, I know, and you host a lot of workshops as well. So yeah, what is your advice for our team here?
Well, I think I could go on a long tangent about any one of those things pretty easily, but to keep it as relevant to everyone's interests and fields as possible, I think the thing that I will say is, many media sub-industries remain very undiverse. And part of the reason for that is that there is a huge financial barrier to entry. Journalism in particular is becoming less racially diverse and less socioeconomically diverse because now to be a journalist, you can't really have a significant amount of college debt. You probably need a little generational help from parents. Photojournalism is even more egregious because you need tens of thousands of dollars of equipment if you just want to start out at a beginner level doing your job. And it's meant that we have lost some very critical, important voices in the field. If we think about, again, the requirement that we have a diverse industry, we've lost a lot of working class journalists because they could not sustain themselves through the pandemic, through just the sort of increasing financial divide in the United States. All that to say, I don't want to sugarcoat it, this is a very difficult industry to enter. But if you are passionate about it, and if it's something that you feel like you have to do with your life, and I deeply support that, and we need people who feel that way, I think the thing to keep in mind is if you don't have a trust fund, and most of us don't, and you need to bartend or design websites or tutor or these are all jobs that I did when I was at the beginning of my career, whatever you have to do to pay your rent and cover your overhead and survive, that is legitimate work. And there is no shame in any of that, but also make sure that you are always carving out the time and the space for the work that you're most passionate about, that makes you happy, that makes you feel aligned with what you see for yourself in the future. Because A, it'll keep your soul happy, and B, allowing yourself to constantly be, even in small increments, even if it's just on weekends or a couple days a month, as long as you are continuing to create that work, to make those connections, to network, to move in that direction, you will be able to keep pushing for what you eventually see as being the career you want. I spent the first 5 years of my career, again, bartender, web designer, tutor, like all of these things, but I was always trying to figure out how can I create the work that speaks to me, that means most to me, that for me typifies what I want to do as a documentary photographer. And you will get there eventually, but it's not an easy landscape financially. but it's doable. And again, I mean, just to harp on this, but it's particularly doable with community. So, you know, you all have a great community just right here, and there are all of these other affinity organizations and women's, you know, business associations and all of these different groups. Find your people, find the people who are going to support you and offer you resources and offer you advice and mentor you, because I think those are some of the most important connections that you can possibly form. And I certainly would never have made it this far without some of the people I've worked alongside in this industry who have been my moral compass, who have given me advice, who have kept me sane for, you know, the last 19 years that I've been a photojournalist.
Thank you, Daniela, for those great insights. Find your people. So we'll keep that in mind. And maybe, Nishi, how are we doing on the time? Maybe we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, sure. Maybe a few questions. I do see one in the chat, or I see a couple in the chat. So Ifra asked, thinking about the future, what do you imagine the visual media space to look like, or what do you hope for it to look like?
That's such a good question. And I mean, I will say, you know, I've been a visual journalist for nearly 2 decades, and I graduated from college directly into a recession. And there have been so many different waves of, you know, whether it's the advent of Instagram or the advent of everyone having a camera in their pocket with the smartphone, with, you know, the invention of AI generated photographs. I think there's always a new crisis where the photo industry is going, oh no, this is it. This is the thing that's going to kill our industry. And I haven't ever truly felt alarm until this past like 6 to 12 months, where like the media landscape is very scary and feels very dire right now. Sports Illustrated just laid off their entire staff. The LA Times just laid off 115 journalists. You know, like this is not great. And so my very baseline primary hope right now is that we just figure out how to be stable, how to support the important necessary work that journalists can and want to do without having to worry about hedge funds coming in and chopping up our organizations and selling them off for parts. You know, it's such a grim, dismal outlook, but I know so many genius, empathetic, brilliant journalists who just want to tell good stories that will create positive change, create advocacy, you know, create legislative change, something, and they don't always have the homes or the support they need to do it, and so they're drifting into other fields. So, you know, I think that feels like the most urgent need right now, is that we figure out how to stabilize, because it very much feels like the wheels are coming off a little bit. And then on a different level, you know, I think not necessarily disconnected from that is the fact that I think we're also in a little bit of a process crisis in the media world around how we go about working in communities. And there has been something very extractive and predatory for a long time about how most journalism is produced. It's this colonial mindset of we in the West are most equipped to tell stories of folks in the global South, of folks who are less privileged than we are. And that's not true. And we have the ability to figure out how to empower local storytellers, how to platform people who are insiders to their communities to tell those stories as well. And I can keep going. I'll try to cut myself off, but I think that is my other hope, is that we can figure out how to develop better, more nuanced codes of ethics around how we conduct our work.
Thank you for that. We have a couple more questions, and I think Julia just responded to what you just said about the layoffs and the reality of that. But just to move on to the next question, Lisa asked, can universities do more to support successful transitions to jobs and careers in media?
Yes. And I say this having, I taught at the University of Montana in their journalism school for one semester, and now I'm teaching at Tulane, but I'm in a communication department, not a journalism department. So I don't actually know all that much about what upper level journalism education looks like right now. But what I can guess is that it does not involve nearly enough education and conversation. Right? It's not that difficult to learn how to be a thoughtful, smart, empathetic ethical journalist. Like journalism in so many ways is a trade. I have a degree in architecture. I went to Columbia. I like snuck out of my classes to go take daily news assignments. Like I was a terrible student and I learned to be a journalist by working for newspapers. What was much harder, because I have been an independent freelance photojournalist for my entire career, was learning how to manage my business, was learning how to do all of my accounting, was learning how to market myself, like all of these other things that have become just as important to my financial survival, to my ability to sustain a career for, again, almost 2 decades in this industry. I had to figure that out the hard way as I was realizing I was entering a field where I would very likely not be formally employed by any news organizations ever. And that still doesn't seem like that's part of photojournalism or journalism education, because many of the folks who are teaching now existed in an industry at a time where it was totally reasonable to think, okay, I'm graduating from college, I'm going to go get a job at a small town newspaper, then maybe I'll move up to a mid-sized newspaper, and then maybe I'll get the job that I want at the LA Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, whatever. That's not really a guaranteed path anymore. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I would argue that even for visual journalism, I would have rather done my career the way I did, because it means I own my entire archive. I have had so much say and so much power over where my images have gone. I like the way that being independent has worked out for me, but it's not for everyone, and it's incredibly stressful and it's very erratic. And especially early on, like you don't know when you're next going to get an assignment, and are you going to have enough money to pay your rent? Are you going to have to do something else? It's, and I'm sorry, I am not in any way trying to dissuade any of you from pursuing careers in journalism. I think it is one of the most important building blocks of democracy that we're watching slowly collapse in the United States. So please do it if you're passionate about it. And it is possible. And I'm very happy to talk to any of you more if you have questions. But we need to shift journalism education to talk about, by the way, you're going to have to do your really complicated taxes as a freelancer. Also, you're going to have to figure out how to market yourself so that photo editors know you exist. Also, you're probably going to have to figure out, there are all of these other things that are just as important as, can you take a good, meaningful, ethical photograph? That's kind of just like the tip of the iceberg.
That's so true. And people in the chat are really appreciative that you're being real about the stresses and all that do come with the dream job. I'll just say one last question from the chat, which is that you mentioned that because of the visual whiplash we get from images on social media, some of the images have lost their significance and power on users. What do you see as a remedy, if there is one?
To some extent, I think the remedy has to come from each of us individually. I think we have to be better about managing our consumption. And I know that's really hard because we carry these little computers around with us 24/7. And whenever we're bored or we're on the subway or we're falling asleep, we just open it and just doom scroll through the 19 different apps that will give us a dopamine hit or something funny or a video of a dog or whatever. And I say this as someone who is like very bad at managing my own screen time, but I think we all have to be much better and much more intentional about what types of media consume, about what types of internet platforms we engage with on a regular basis, and do our best to remember, like this is worthless. This is nothing, right? Like there are things about what used to be Twitter that I think were incredibly valuable in terms of community building. There are things about Instagram that were incredibly helpful for my career. But at the end of the day, it was a lot of time spent in platforms that are allowing large corporations to profit that don't really serve us. And I have my own personal philosophy about the types of images that I want to consume. I made very conscious decisions. For instance, I have never watched body cam footage of the murder of a Black person in the United States. That is a choice I have made. I do not want to see that. I understand how critical and urgent that problem is without needing to witness it. But sometimes you don't always have a choice, right? There was an era in Facebook where videos would autoplay, and so you would just scroll past something and see something without your consent. We need to figure out how we can monitor and restrict our own consumption of violent imagery, of things that aren't necessarily going, I'm all over the place here, but I think at its best, news imagery and complicated imagery expands our understanding of the world. It exposes us to people and places that we might not ever encounter or fully understand. It gives, and some of us are more visual learners than others. And so photographs really drive home the point of a person's lived experience of a trauma that they're experiencing. And that's great. But if there is not a then tangible next step, and we're just consuming endless cycles of traumatic imagery, that doesn't do anything for us, and it also doesn't do anything for them. So I think to some extent, it's on us to self-regulate, because certainly media companies and social media platforms have not figured out how to regulate, because they benefit financially from us doom scrolling and from us just endlessly flipping through the horrible images that we often are exposed to. So I think, unfortunately, for our own mental well-being and also for our own the benefit of our engagement with visual media, we have to figure out how to limit ourselves.
Thank you so much for that. I don't see any other questions in the chat for now, so I'm gonna close it out. So thank you, Daniella and Ardra, for this very important conversation on media, its role on human rights, and the role that individuals play in this. I hope that everyone else found this conversation as inspiring and informative as I did. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join the conversation tonight.